The story usually ends on July 2nd, 1937. Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were on their way to Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They were nearing the end of their historic flight around the world. Their last radio transmission was weak, confused. Earhart said they were flying on a line, searching. "We are running on line north and south." Then, silence. The official story is simple. They ran out of fuel, crashed into the deep ocean, and sank without a trace. The Lockheed Electra 10E, along with two of the most famous aviators of the age, was lost forever. It's a neat, tidy ending to a tragic story. But what if that wasn't the end? What if it was the beginning of another story? One of survival, desperation, and slow, lonely death on an uninhabited island. This is the Gardner Island Hypothesis. It suggests Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan didn't crash into the ocean. It suggests they made an emergency landing on a remote coral atoll and lived for days, weeks, maybe even months as castaways. To understand this theory, you have to go back to that final flight. They had been in the air for nearly 20 hours, flying from New Guinea. Howland Island was their refueling stop. It was less than 2 square miles. Finding it was a supreme act of navigation. Noonan was one of the best, but this was pushing the limits of 1930s technology. They were relying on celestial navigation and a radio direction finder. Down below, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was waiting. They were meant to provide a radio beacon for Earhart to home in on. But things went wrong. There was confusion about radio frequencies. Earhart couldn't hear the Itasca's voice transmissions, and the Itasca could only hear Earhart's voice, not the signal they needed to get a fix on her plane's location. Her last transmissions paint a picture of growing uncertainty. "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low." The final confirmed message was at 8:43 a.m. local time. She sounded calm but concerned. She said she was flying on the 157 to 337 line. This is the key. A line of position is a line on a map derived from a sun observation on which a navigator knows they are located. They were somewhere on that line. Howland Island was on that line. But if they missed it and they kept flying, where else on that line could they have gone? If you extend that line of position to the southeast, about 350 nautical miles from Howland, you find another island. It was called Gardner Island back then. Today it's known as Nikumaroro. It's an uninhabited coral atoll, a ring of land around a central lagoon. The Gardner Island theory, championed for decades by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIAR, proposes a logical sequence of events. Earhart and Noonan realize they've missed Howland. Their fuel is critically low. They don't turn back, they don't just ditch in the open ocean, they turn south, following their line of position, their last known good piece of navigational data. It's a desperate search for any piece of land, and they find one. Gardner Island. Landing a 12,000-pound airplane on a coral atoll is not easy. You can't land on the beach or in the jungle. But Gardner Island has a wide, flat reef surrounding it. At low tide, this reef becomes a smooth, hard surface, almost like a runway. The hypothesis is that Earhart, a highly skilled pilot, saw the reef, waited for low tide, and put the Electra down. It wouldn't have been a gentle landing. The landing gear would have been torn off. The plane would have been heavily damaged, but it would have been a survivable landing. They would have climbed out of their wrecked plane, alive, on solid ground. They were castaways. This is a compelling story, but without evidence, it's just a story. The case for the Gardner Island Hypothesis rests on 3 pillars: post-loss radio signals, archaeological evidence found on the island, and a re-examination of historical records. Let's start with the radio signals. In the days and nights after the plane disappeared, radio operators across the Pacific and even in North America reported hearing faint, desperate calls for help. The U.S. Navy, which was conducting the official search, dismissed most of these as hoaxes or misinterpretations. Atmospheric conditions in the Pacific can make radio signals do strange things, but some of the signals were different, they were credible. A teenager in Rock Springs, Wyoming, a woman in Toronto, Canada, and a housewife in St. Petersburg, Florida, named Betty Klink, all reported hearing what they believe was Earhart. Betty's story is particularly striking. She listened for hours, scribbling down what she heard in a notebook. She heard a woman's voice, panicked, sometimes angry, sometimes fading out. She heard pleas for help. She heard mentions of a man, presumably Noonan, needing medical care. She heard the words New York City. Earhart's plane had YC in its registration number. The transmissions were sporadic and weak. TIAR believes these signals were real, and they believe they came from the Electra, sitting on the reef at Gardner Island. The plane's radios could only transmit if an engine was running to power the generator. The castaways, the theory goes, could only start an engine when the tide was low and the propellers weren't in the water. This would explain why the signals were intermittent. They would start an engine, send out frantic calls, and then stop as the tide came back in. Eventually, the signals stopped for good. Tyler's hypothesis is that after several days, a storm or high surf washed the battered Electra off the reef and into the deep ocean, silencing their calls forever. The official Navy search did include Gardner Island. A pilot flew over the atoll on July 9th, a week after the disappearance. His report is tantalizing. He reported seeing signs of recent habitation, but he saw no people and no plane. He assumed the signs were from a group of Polynesian colonists who had been on the island a few years prior but had left. He dismissed it and flew on. Was this a tragic misinterpretation? Did he fly over the island while Earhart and Noonan were hiding from the sun under some trees? Their plane already washed away. It's a haunting possibility. For years, that was it. The trail went cold, the story faded into legend. Then, in the 1980s, TR was formed, and they began looking at the case with fresh eyes. They focused on Gardner Island, and they started finding things. The first major clue came not from a new discovery, but from an old file. In 1940, 3 years after Earhart vanished, the British were attempting to colonize Gardner Island. A British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher was in charge. On the southeast end of the island, in a remote spot, he discovered a partial human skeleton. Next to the remains, he found part of a woman's shoe, part of a man's shoe, a sextant box, and evidence of campfires where turtles and birds had been cooked and eaten. Gallagher suspected the remains might be Earhart's. He sent the bones he found, 13 in all, to a medical examiner in Fiji, Dr. D.W. Hoodless. Hoodless took measurements and concluded the bones belonged to a stocky, middle-aged male, likely of Polynesian or mixed European descent. The case was closed. The bones were subsequently lost, a common occurrence in old colonial archives. For decades, that was the final word. The bones weren't Earhart's, but TR wasn't satisfied. In 1998, they tracked down Dr. Hoodless's original measurement files. They gave the data to modern forensic anthropologists. Using a computer database called Fordisk, which compares skeletal measurements to a vast library of population data, they came to a very different conclusion. The analysis showed the bones were more consistent with a tall female of European ancestry than any other demographic. Someone exactly like Amelia Earhart. The original 1941 analysis, they argued, was flawed, based on outdated methods. While it's not definitive proof without the bones themselves, it's a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence. The skeleton found on Gardner Island could very well have been Amelia Earhart. But what about the other items found with the skeleton? The sextant box. Gallagher described it as being for a Brandis naval sextant. Fred Noonan used a Brandis sextant. The shoes. The woman's shoe was a size 9, similar to the American-made blusher, Oxford-style Earhart wore in photos from her world flight. TR began organizing archaeological expeditions to Nikumaroro. The island is a harsh, unforgiving place. It's hot, covered in dense scrub, and crawling with coconut crabs. But over the years, their patient work began to yield results. They focused their efforts on the spot where Gallagher reported finding the skeleton, an area they called the Seven Site, named after a distinctive clump of 7 palm trees. There, and in the surrounding area, they found a collection of artifacts that simply do not belong on an uninhabited Pacific island. They found a zipper pull from a 1930s flight jacket. They found a small broken pocket knife of a type issued to U.S. military aircrews. They found shards of glass from a small octagonal jar. After years of research, they identified the jar. It once held Dr. C.H. Berry's freckle ointment. The ointment was marketed to women in the 1930s to lighten freckles. It's a well-documented fact that Amelia Earhart disliked her freckles. It's a small, personal detail, but it paints a vivid picture. A famous woman, stranded on a deserted island, still carrying a small piece of her normal life with her. They found more. They found makeshift tools. Pieces of plexiglass that had been shaped and beveled. They found remnants of many small campfires, along with the bones of fish, sea turtles, and dozens of birds. This wasn't the site of a single meal. This was a place where someone or some people had lived and survived for a significant period of time. The sheer volume of animal bones suggests a long, hard struggle for existence. Perhaps the most compelling piece of physical evidence is a small piece of aluminum. It was found on the island in 1991. For years, its significance was unknown. Then, a photograph of Earhart's Electra, taken in Miami during a repair stop early in her world flight, came to light. The photo shows a custom-made aluminum patch riveted over a window on the rear fuselage. Tire researchers meticulously compared the artifact from Nikumaroro to the patch in the photograph. They claim the dimensions, the shape, and the pattern of the rivet holes are a perfect match. If they are right, it means this piece of metal can only have come from one specific airplane in all of history, Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra. The theory is that when the plane was battered by the surf on the reef, this patch was torn off and washed ashore, to be discovered decades later. So, let's piece together the whole story, the narrative that the Gardner Island Hypothesis presents. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan land their damaged plane on the reef flat. They are alive but stranded. Noonan may have been injured in the landing. Some of the post-loss radio calls hinted at this. For the first few days, their world revolves around the tides. When the water is low, they scramble out to the plane. They run an engine, charge the batteries, and send out desperate radio calls. The world hears them faintly, but no one can pinpoint their location. The official search planes fly right over them, but by then, the plane has been dragged off the reef into the ocean. The rescuers see signs of recent habitation, but assume it's old. They fly away. Hope is lost. Now the real survival story begins. They are alone. They have to find water and food. This rainwater can be collected in whatever containers they have. The island is teeming with life. There are birds in the trees, fish, and turtles in the lagoon. They learn to catch them, to cook them over small fires. They move their camp from the exposed shoreline to a more sheltered spot inland, the Seven site. Based on the evidence of a single skeleton being found, the theory speculates that Fred Noonan died relatively early, perhaps from his injuries or from illness. Amelia Earhart is now completely alone. For weeks, maybe months, she survives. She is no longer just a pilot, she is a castaway. She uses her pocket knife, makes tools from the wreckage that washes ashore. She eats what she can catch. She watches the horizon every day, hoping for a ship that never comes. Finally, weakened by exposure, malnutrition, or disease, she lies down in her small camp and dies. The giant coconut crabs of the island scatter her bones. Her story ends not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet fade into nothingness. It's a powerful and tragic narrative. It transforms Amelia Earhart from a victim of a technical failure into the hero of an incredible survival story, even one she didn't win. Of course, the Gardner Island Hypothesis is not without its critics. Many still believe the simplest explanation is the most likely she ran out of gas and crashed at sea. They argue that the radio calls were hoaxes. They point out that the forensic analysis of the bones is not definitive proof, as the bones themselves are lost. They question the identification of the aluminum patch, suggesting it could be from any number of World War II-era planes that crashed in the Pacific. They argue that the collection of artifacts on Nikumaroro is just a random assortment of junk washed ashore over many years. And there is the big unanswered question, where is the plane? If it was washed off the reef, it should be in the deep water, just offshore. Tyar, and more recently, Dr. Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, have conducted extensive deep-sea sonar searches of the slopes around Nikumaroro. They have found shipwrecks and geological anomalies, but so far no sign of a 1937 Lockheed Electra. Finding the wreckage is the final piece of the puzzle. Without it, the Gardner Island Hypothesis remains just that, a hypothesis. A very well-researched, compelling, and plausible hypothesis, but not a proven fact. There are other theories, of course. The most persistent one is that Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese, who were secretly militarizing islands in the Pacific before World War II. This theory suggests they were taken to Saipan, interrogated as spies, and eventually executed. It's a dramatic story, fueled by unconfirmed eyewitness accounts and shadowy government conspiracies, but it lacks any of the hard physical evidence that supports the Gardner Island theory. There are no credible documents, no artifacts, no wreckage. It remains almost entirely in the realm of speculation. So we are left with a choice between competing narratives. There is the official story, a sudden, clean end in the vast, empty ocean. It is simple and requires no further explanation. It explains their disappearance, but it fails to account for the post-loss radio signals, the skeleton found in 1940, or the strange collection of 1930s American artifacts on a remote Pacific atoll. Then there is the Gardner Island story. It is messy, complicated, and tragic. But it does something the official story cannot. It provides a single, coherent explanation that ties all the disparate pieces of evidence together. The line of position leads to the island. The landing on the reef explains the post-loss radio signals. The castaway scenario explains the skeleton, the campsite, the personal effects, and the piece of the plane. That all fits. Did Amelia Earhart live out her life as a castaway? We may never know for sure. The truth may still be waiting at the bottom of the ocean, either near Howland Island or near Nikumaroro. Or perhaps the final clues were carried away by crabs and tides long ago, but the Gardner Island Hypothesis has changed the way we think about her final days. It asks us to look beyond the image of the lost pilot and consider the possibility of the determined survivor. It presents a vision of Amelia Earhart not just as a woman who pushed the boundaries of aviation, but as a human being who, faced with the ultimate disaster, fought to live. She didn't just disappear into the sky. She may have landed, survived, and fought for every last breath on a lonely stretch of sand and coral 1,000 miles from anywhere. And that is a far more powerful and far more human story.